It happened in the open, a summer morning, a public park, families not far away. And there was a witness, someone who saw the whole thing, someone close enough to touch her. And still, for 16 years, this murder went unsolved. In that time, police would build a case against an innocent man, watch it collapse in court, and miss the real killer more than once, while he went on to kill again. And the single piece of evidence that would finally name him had been there from the very first morning. It sat on her clothing, untested for 16 years, waiting for science to catch up. This is the murder of Rachel Nickell, and it is the long, difficult question of how a case with a witness went so wrong for so long. Rachel Nickell was 23 years old. She had worked as a model, but the part of her life that mattered most was the one she had built quietly, a home in southwest London with her partner, Andre Hanscom, and their 2-year-old son, Alexander. By the accounts of those who knew her, she was warm and easy to be around. The kind of person, Andre once said, who could squeeze fun out of almost anything. On the morning of the 15th of July, 1992, Rachel and Alexander waved to Andre from the window of their flat as he left for work. Then mother and son set out on a walk they took often, together with the family dog, Molly. Their destination was Wimbledon Common, 1,100 acres of open parkland on the edge of the city. Rachel chose it, those close to her would later say, because she believed it was safer than the busier parks near her home. It was an ordinary morning. There is nothing in it that points to what came next. And that, in its way, is the heart of the matter. Because what happened on the Common that day was not supposed to be possible. Not in a place like that. Not in daylight. Not with other people within reach. What we know of the next hour comes from the scene itself, and from a witness who could barely speak. Rachel and Alexander walked along a quiet, wooded path. At some point, a man was there, a man carrying a black bag. What followed was sudden and brief. Rachel was attacked. She was sexually assaulted, and she was stabbed. The violence was extreme. The investigators who saw the scene would describe it years later as among the worst they had ever encountered. We will not dwell on it. The detail that matters here is this. It happened fast, in daylight, and then the man was gone. Alexander, 2 years old, was knocked to the ground. He was not physically harmed. When a passerby came upon the scene a short time later, this is what they found. A small boy beside his mother, trying to wake her. He did not understand that she was already gone. He simply wanted her to get up. That image, a toddler, the only witness beside the body of his mother, would become one of the most haunting in modern British crime. And it defined the investigation's central problem from the very first minute. Because the one person who had seen everything was a child far too young and far too frightened to tell anyone what he had seen. The scene itself gave investigators a little. It gave them the savagery of the attack. It gave them a small, strange detail, a piece of paper left on Rachel's body, and it gave them the shape of a man who had appeared from nowhere and vanished just as fast. What it did not give them was the one thing they needed most, a name. The murder of Rachel Nickell did not stay a private tragedy for long. Within days, it was a national one. A young mother killed in daylight in front of her small child, in a place people had thought of as safe. It struck at something deep, and the public wanted an answer. The pressure on the investigation was immense, and it was immediate, and that pressure would go on to shape almost everything that happened next. including the mistakes. In the hours and days after the murder, investigators had an enormous amount of public attention and very little to work with. The attack had been frenzied, but the common was open ground, and the scene gave back no clear forensic trail to a named person. There were no security cameras on that path. There was no weapon left behind. And there was, at first, no witness who could speak, except for one. Alexander had seen it all. He was 2 years old. In the weeks that followed, with the careful help of a child psychologist, investigators tried gently to learn what he could tell them. It was not much. It could never have been. But what he gave them was real. He described a man, a younger white man in a white shirt, carrying a black bag. He spoke, in a small child's words, of the man washing his hands in a stream nearby, and then walking away. In one account, he said the man had disappeared into the distance like a ghost. It was the truth, from the only person who saw it, but it was not something that could convict anyone. On its own, it could not produce a name. And so, under enormous pressure to find that name, the investigation turned to a technique that was, in Britain at the time, still very new. Offender profiling. A forensic psychologist was asked to describe the kind of man who might have committed a crime like this, the personality behind the violence, and from that profile, the investigation moved toward a suspect, a local man who walked his dog on the common. We will return to that man, and to what was done to him in the name of solving this case, because the path the investigation took from here would become almost as infamous as the crime itself. But first, the evidence that the profile could never provide. The evidence that, more than a decade later, would finally answer the question of who. It came from Rachel's own clothing. On the morning of the murder, forensic officers had lifted traces from her body and her clothes using adhesive tape, a routine method that captures whatever microscopic material is present, even when nothing can be seen. One of those samples, taken in 1992, held a tiny amount of male DNA, but it was too small. The technology of the time simply could not read it, so it waited. A decade passed. The case went cold. The anniversary came and went, year after year, with no answer. And then, in the early 2000s, a cold case review team returned to the file, this time armed with DNA techniques that had not existed when Rachel died. Over roughly 18 months, forensic scientists re-examined her clothing, piece by piece, and the sample that had been far too small to read in 1992 could now, at last, be read. It produced the profile of a man. It did not match her partner. It did not match her son. In 2004, that profile was matched to a name already held in the database, a man who, by then, had spent years locked inside a high-security psychiatric hospital. His name was Robert Napper. The evidence that finally identified the killer of Rachel Nickell had been on her clothing from the very first morning. It had simply been waiting for more than a decade for the science to catch up to what it already held. To understand how this case went wrong, we have to go back to that suspect. The local man the profile had led police toward. His name was Colin Stagg. There was no forensic evidence linking him to the murder. None. What there was a profile that seemed to fit, and a public desperate for an arrest. And so, to build a case where the evidence did not exist, the police tried something extraordinary. An undercover officer using a false name began writing to Stagg, posing as a woman romantically interested in him. Over months, she encouraged him to share violent fantasies, hoping he would reveal knowledge that only the killer could have. He never did. even when she pressed him directly, suggesting that if he had committed the murder, it would not change her feelings. He told her plainly that he had not. He was arrested and charged anyway. Colin Stagg spent 13 months in custody awaiting trial. And in 1994, at the Old Bailey, the case collapsed. The judge threw it out, condemning the undercover operation as deceptive conduct of the grossest kind and ruling that none of it could be used. Stagg walked free, but he did not walk back into his old life. For years afterward, he lived under a shadow of public suspicion for a crime he did not commit. It would be more than a decade before he was formally cleared, apologized to, and paid more than £700,000 in compensation for what had been done to him. But the cost of looking at the wrong man was far greater than one ruined reputation. Because while the investigation was fixed on Colin Stagg, the real killer was still free, and he did not stop. In November of 1993, 16 months after Rachel was murdered, a young mother named Samantha Bissay was killed in her home in Plumstead, in southeast London, together with her 4-year-old daughter, Jasmine. The detectives investigating that case saw the similarities to the murder of Rachel Nickell, and they raised a question. Could the same unknown man be responsible for both? That suggestion was put to the team investigating Rachel's murder, and it was rejected, according to later accounts, with hostility. The team had their suspect. They were not looking for another. The man who killed Samantha and Jasmine Bissay was Robert Napper, the same man whose DNA was, even then, sitting unread on Rachel Nickell's clothing. And Napper had been close to the edges of the system for years. In 1989, his own mother contacted police to report that he had confessed to a rape. It was not pursued. He had been linked to a series of attacks across southeast London. He had even been eliminated from one inquiry, in part because he was over 6 feet tall. A map was later found in his home, with locations marked on it. One of them was Wimbledon Common. In 2010, an official review reached a blunt conclusion that the case was marked by a catalog of bad decisions and errors, and that chances to stop Napper had been missed long before Rachel died. On the 18th of December, 2008, at the Old Bailey, Robert Napper pleaded guilty to the manslaughter of Rachel Nickell on the grounds of diminished responsibility. He was, the court accepted, a man suffering from paranoid schizophrenia. He was ordered to be detained indefinitely at Broadmoor, the high-security hospital where he remains. The judge told him he was, on any view, a very dangerous man. 16 years after a 2-year-old boy knelt beside his mother and asked her to get up, the question of who had taken her finally had an answer. So what is confirmed? The DNA is confirmed. The conviction is confirmed. The failures, too, are now a matter of public record, set down in black and white. But there are things no verdict can return. It cannot return the 16 years. It cannot give Colin Stagg back the years he spent accused of a murder he did not commit. And it cannot undo the hardest fact in this entire case, the fact that sits underneath all the rest, that a young mother and her 4-year-old daughter, Samantha and Jasmine Bissay, might still be alive if the investigation had been willing to look beyond the man it had already decided was guilty. Rachel's partner, Andre, and their son, Alexander, left England within months of her death. They built a quiet life abroad, away from the cameras and the headlines. Alexander grew up. And in time, he spoke about his mother. Not about how she died, but about who she was. He has said that he forgave her killer long before he ever knew the name, that he remembers her warmth, her smile, the small ordinary things, that he chose in the end to define his life by love rather than by what was taken. This case changed British policing. It changed how the courts treat undercover operations and how seriously the justice system weighs the danger of certainty, the danger of deciding too early that you already have your man. But some questions it leaves open. When an investigation is under this much pressure, with a frightened public demanding an answer, how do we keep it from convincing itself of the wrong thing? Was this the failure of a few individuals or of the system around them? And how many times does a case have to teach this lesson before it changes for good? We've laid out what the evidence shows. What you take from it is yours to decide. Tell us in the comments what you think.